Hello and welcome to another episode of Metal Effort. My name's Nehemiah, and today we're going to look at this piece of metal, the Tangram Rumble. That's right, guys, I'm doing a budget knife. I've got a couple more budget knives I'll go over here coming up in the next month or so, as well as more mass drop knives. I've got mass drop knives for days, guys, days. But if you are interested in budget options, let me know. I am in the hunt of good knives. I don't discriminate if it costs a little amount or a lot of amount, but I just want to check them out and see what's good and tell you guys about it. So let me know in the comments if this is your cup of tea. First thing we want to do is a size comparison. I've got our old standbys, the Spyderco PM2. Ooh, almost a chopped up Nehemiah there. And pair 3. So this is not a small knife. Usually small knives aren't ready to rumble, but this sucker is. So let's get some measurements just because, I don't know, reasons. This is just under 4 inches from tip to the shoulder. Cutting length is like 3.75. It's got some funky grind lines going on here, as you can see, but I think it's still a usable knife. We'll get into the full dent. The dent is the decent, the excellent, the nitpicks, and the terrible of this piece of metal. So before we jump into that, I want to do a quick weigh-in. This is a big knife, keep in mind. And weight-wise, it's not that bad. It's under 5 ounces, which I think is like, I don't know, that magic size is just like the difference between an overly heavy, big, beefy knife and something that you can get away with EDC. I think this is just under it, nowhere close to 1 ounce an inch. I mean, that's not that far. It's 0.8 ounces off from being basically that. And so it's not too bad. So in the first thing I want to talk about in the decent is the internal milling, because that is how they're, pulling this off. You see these little circles going on. It's not superly, aggressively milled, but enough to where it can make a difference. It's pretty much only on the presentation side. You can't really see too much going on the lock bar side, but it's there, and it does help. It'd probably be over that 5 ounce mark if they hadn't done that. Next thing is the price. Now, this is also a clarification because if you've watched any other reviews of this knife, there's 2 different ones that are both Tangram Rumbles, and one is critically flawed, potentially, for 90% of the population, where the other isn't. This is got the feature, like many knives do, of having the clip be reversible, and it comes on the non-presentation side or right hand tip up carry position by default, but you have the option to have it on the left in case you're a lefty. Now, if you go to Amazon right now and you search for this knife, there's 2 different ones. There's one for like $43, which is this one and has the option for both, and then there's one for like $25, and it only has holes to post it on one side, and it's the left-hand side for some reason. So I know like Michael Elmer reviewed this on his channel, and he got one of the cheaper ones. I thought they were all like this, but I sent him a text message like, homie, I got it on both sides on mine. I don't know what's up. And so we kind of just chuckled about it. But doing some research, there is a difference. And so I guess if you want to be right-handed, you gotta pay the popper. I mean, I don't know what that's about. But if you're a lefty, this could be your lucky day because you can get this knife for like dirt cheap. I mean, $25 is really, really, really inexpensive. I'm going to judge this knife on it costing $43 because the majority of us are right-handed. Not that I don't love you lefties. You guys are swell. Next thing I want to talk about is the steel. This is a Kudo 440, which is similar to 440C steel as far as my research has taken me, which is, it's fine. I think for a budget knife, you're going to need to temper your expectations on blade steel anyway, but I think this is workable. It's not like it's going to instantly dull on you, but obviously it's nothing that's going to last much longer, like they're, S30V or anything like super budgety. But, it is what it is, and I am not gonna, this is a loaner knife, I'm not gonna push the limits of this steel. You'll have to find other channels to test the steel and see how it actually performs in real world. Just ballpark range, somewhere in the 440C is what you ought to expect from it. Next thing I want to talk about is this blade. So I think for this, I want to zoom in a little here. So I've got this crazy swedge going with like a harpoon type deal. And I think this is called like a Japanese tanto, if I'm not mistaken. I should have researched that more. But instead of having the line go straight down right here, where those two grind edges, I should say, differentiate, this continues through. So there's kind of a unique way that those two lines connect, where a normal tanto type of connection would be just, straight. So I think this is more aesthetically pleasing. I don't know how it affects, positively or negatively on actual, cutting performance. I would imagine it's not going to be that different, but aesthetically, I think it's pretty pleasing. And you'll notice this is kind of a polished stone wash. I've got a light that's about, 20 feet away from me, and it's beaming off of this guy. It's not the same hue as my other lights, so my camera's going crazy, but this blade has a really nice finish for the cost, and it's very good. I would imagine it hides scratches pretty well, but still looks classy and like some work was put into it. So pretty big fan of the blade shape as far as aesthetics go, and the grind lines and swedge. There's a lot of detailed work that's going on here, and I just want to, give it credit where credit's due. Not to say that the blade is perfect, mind you, but in terms of, the production levels of the grind lines and the finish, it's in the positive section. It's in the decent. These thumb studs are pretty useful. I've definitely encountered worse and better. They do the job. They're in the right spot for the most part. I don't think it's as egregious as the Eeyore knife. It's just positioned in a better spot. It's further up and it's further away from the knife, which is how this knife should have been. But that does make all the difference, because you can do like a straight up and you can get some force behind it, or you can do the flick out just as well. And, it's on both sides. It's ambidextrous. I actually appreciate it, not because I'm ambidextrous myself, but because I like to spider flick everything. And it actually works pretty well with that thumb stud. It's kind of weird. You wouldn't normally think to spider flick a thumb stud knife like this, but you could totally do it. And in fact, I actually prefer that method. I think it's more authoritative and works more often when I do the spidey flick than any of the other two options, which is thumb stud, you're actually using your thumb, or the flipper tab. Now, the flipper tab. Flipper tab works. It's not like anything special. There's no jimping. It's not particularly sharp per se, but it's definitely not overly chamfered. It's enough of a just, flat ledge that it's pretty hard for me to fall off of it. And it works, but the two times I handed this knife to a non-knife person, they tended to be like a little timid, and it would just like come out like this. Us knife guys or girls that, use our knives, we know to kind of light switch it with a little bit more authority, just because you don't know how strong the detent on a particular knife might be. And so if you, flip the knife in the safe way that you've learned to do, it will open pretty much every time. But if you're trying to, slow roll it even a little bit, it's going to barely get there. The detent isn't weak enough to like pop the blade out or anything like that, but it's not particularly hard of a detent. The flipper works well, but I would say my priority on this knife of ways I prefer to do it is spidey flick, thumb stud, then flipper tab. When usually if they're all equal, I like spidey flick, flipper tab, then thumb stud, so that's something to just note. Now, speaking of the action is on ball bearings. And so, the size of the blade kind of helps this knife become pretty falchetty without having to like jostle it too much. I mean, that one initial kind of movement, rotation should do the trick to get it to come down, once the detent is on the tang of the blade. So it's good. I definitely think the weight of the blade is doing most of the heavy lifting here, But still, good action is good action. I don't really care if it's, because it's a multi-row bearing system that's got like ceramic balls, or if it's something that's just straightforward steel, and it gets the job done. So the action is good, especially if you're considering this, in that $25 range for you lucky lefties. I think it's batting way above its grade. For $50, 40, 30-ish or whatever in that price category, it's about where I'd expect it to be with the competition these days. Another random thing I'd like to mention is kind of like just random, but I really like the box. The box is really classy. It's just basically cardboard, but they've managed to pretty it up such that it's actually really interesting. So this is obviously for a different knife, but same idea. I like it. It's classy. It kind of goes with the Tangram kind of beigeness of the knife, but it works okay, and I appreciate that. One thing I do like about the clip, as long as you can put it on the correct side of the knife, is it's pretty deep carry. Now, it's not like an all-star like on the Backlash, where not only is it deep carry, but the screws are flush. The screws are not flush. There's plenty of space. It's not like you can't get your pants up over those screws, but it is kind of a little bit of a wall. Still, this is better than the vast majority of knives, and notice where it is. It's in the correct position, in my opinion. I think the clip should take priority over the lanyard hole if you're trying to decide, should we put the clip here or should we put it here? The answer is always here. Anyway, so they got that right on the knife, and I like it. The clip itself is, it's fine. It's decent. It does go up really high. I think maybe a little bit too much. And then this is kind of small to get into your pants, depending on what kind of pants you're getting. You can make it work. It's not that bad. Overall, I like it, and there's not any hot spots off the clip, so that's good. Another thing that I like about this knife is when it's in your pocket, it actually fits in there decently well. The clip is cantered off to the side. The flipper tab is not small by any means, but again, it's not particularly sharp really, and we've kind of had this conversation of like, what valuables are you putting in your knife pocket side? I don't know, but it's fine. If the knife is by itself in the pocket or with something else you don't care about, maybe keys or something, it's not like a monstrosity. I think it works better than I thought it would. I thought this would be just terrible in my pocket, but I did take it to work with me and did a full day of carry, and it was fine. Nobody was like, "Ooh, what do you got in your pocket?" They never do that anyway, but yeah. Last thing I want to mention in the decent section is the fit and finish. Fit and finish is okay. It's, centered, which is pretty cool on a knife this cheap. Mechanically speaking, I think it's good to go. There could be more chamfering. We'll get around to this later, but as far as what they intended to do, I think they did. Most of the positive points are coming from this blade, just the grind lines, the evenness of the edge, considering it's a difficult thing to do. I mean, this is not a standard blade shape. And I think they pulled it off. I think a lot of time and attention went into this blade, and that's getting a lot of these bonus points for the fit and finish. And the fact that it's centered and the action is decent and it wasn't dirty or anything, I think all those things kind of put it into the positive section, even though there's a few nitpicks considering the cost. I think the fit and finish overall is pretty good. Next, in the excellent section, I've got one thing to talk about, and that's the ergonomics. This knife is surprisingly comfortable. Now, there's things that are uncomfortable about this knife, but as far as you gripping it in your hand and using the knife, it's good. It's excellent, in fact. The little contours right here really kind of contribute to that. The knife is pretty thick, which, does fill the hand. It's the right length. It doesn't have too much hanging off on the edge to where it's like awkward or anything like that. The, finger kind of choil here thing is good and comfortable. You got some pretty heavy chamfers on this side on the G10, which again helps with it kind of fitting into the narrow gap of your hand right here. So it all fits pretty well. I would say This is solid like 8.5, maybe 9.0 in terms of ergonomics of like if I had to use this knife all day long, I don't think, I'd be rubbing my hand raw anywhere. There's no like clear hot spots. Now, opening or closing the knife is a whole nother issue, but I'll get into that. Speaking of which, let's talk about our nitpicks. We've got a few things. So the jimping right here is really deep and aggressive. And it's not one of those like fake aggressive ones where like you have something like the Mannix where those little spikes are really deep, but then you look from the side and they're kind of covered up by the G10 on the side so that you're not actually going too deep into those jimpings. This is not that case. They actually jimp the G10 as well, so it's pretty deep and pretty severe because it's not just one material that they chamfered, it's two. It's the steel and the G10. And so I feel like the finish that you would have on one wouldn't necessarily match the other. So sure, you get the G10 rounded, but maybe the steel isn't, or vice versa, probably vice versa. And so if you take your thumb and you rub it, it's like digesting my thumb. I mean, look at this. It's just destroying it. So I'm not a huge fan of that, especially when you go to flip the knife. You go to flip the knife and your finger just scrapes across that. So yeah, those two things really, bother me of like using the knife if I'm going to move. Now, if I lock in, it's fine. But if I try to move at all, like if I slipped forward on that jimp, it would just scrape me up pretty bad. Now, if it doesn't move, it's fine. It's not like it's stabbing into me. There does need to be movement. So it's doing its job, but if something jostles the knife or you, it's going to hurt a little bit. It's going to munch up your fingers. But more than anything, when you're flipping it, it's just right into that. Second thing is the jimping on the back. The jimping on the back is chamfered even less. It looks the same, but I tell you, man, this stuff is sharp as all get out. This is not pleasant. It's not one of those things where I'm putting it in here in my palm and it's somehow like it just the shape of the knife. Like if I'm flipping it, that part isn't even touching my hand at all. But when I, absent-mindedly like scrape past, it's like, yeah, okay. I don't know what it would take to like sand that down. Obviously, respirator issues and things like that. But I don't know. It's just unnecessary, and they didn't take the time to like chamfer it properly. So, boo. I don't like that. And last thing, I'll keep mentioning this unless it's not on the knife. Too much writing, too much garbo on this. It's not that big of a deal. I've definitely seen worse. At least it's off of the grind line, which is like one of my pet peeves. If you put Tangram right here, I'm just like ready to punch babies. But it's out of the way and it's fine, but still a nitpick. If it was any more than this or in a worse position, it would definitely be in my terrible section. So it's just barely scraping by unacceptable. Speaking of the terrible section, let's get off into the terrible section. First thing is it's very awkward and painful to disengage this liner lock. Now, it locks up just fine. It's like over 50%. So you got a ways to go, and then you look at the side, and there's only barely any room for you to actually come horizontally and get into that lock bar. A lot of locks will get out of the way a little bit more than this and give you more room to get in there. Something like this, where it's angled up a little bit more than even this gigantic knife. This actually has more room for me to get my thumb in there and move the lock bar over, liner lock over. So that's like bad. But then what makes it worse is that you stick your finger in there and it's just super sharp. I mean, you could basically see, skin parts getting shaved off right there. This is really frustrating because it just makes me not want to open the knife, because if I open the knife, I know I'm gonna need to close it, which means I'm gonna have to jab my finger into this like finger skin shaver. I really don't like this. I don't get it. Like, make the lock bar a little bit more raised up and then just chamfer it, and this would be a champ. It would be awesome. But as it is, this is just downright unusable by me. This is so egregious and so painful and so annoying. I just don't want to use the knife. It's totally a deal breaker for me, this alone. It seems kind of silly because it'd be really easy to fix this, but alas. The next terrible thing and the last terrible thing is just how annoying this knife is going to be to sharpen. I am a novice sharpener for sure, and I know there's like, little triangle type rods that you can get for your KME or, SharpMaker Pro or whatever type systems, but this is not something that most of us are just going to have the tools specifically made for these crazy recurves. This part of the knife you could probably do just fine. You're going to have a hard time getting it into your system or like awkwardly holding it if you're going to be doing like, manual hand stone sharpening. But regardless, this is going to be a pain in the butt to sharpen, and because it's that cheap steel, you're going to need to do it if you're using the knife. And so I feel like I'm kind of in a bind of like, okay, I just want a cheap beater, something I can use all the time. Okay, but then that means I'm going to need to sharpen all the time. Okay, which means I'm going to bang my head into a brick wall before I decide to use this knife. I just don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. It's cool. People have said, oh, it's the poor man's Grimsmo Norseman. And it's like, with a $900 knife, sure, be weird, be different. I'll send it off to somebody to sharpen if I don't want to invest in the parts and the time and the practice to do that. I mean, what knives do you even practice on? You just buy, is this knife exist? You just buy a bunch of the left-handed ones, buy 4 of them and just practice sharpening on those before you sharpen your Norseman. Is that it? Maybe I'm missing this. Maybe this is great. I don't know. So with that, let's get into the conclusion. The conclusion is this. My philosophy for budget knives is different than I think most people. And with a budget knife, it needs to be doing something that my normal knives can't do. Some kind of roll or something like, oh, I wouldn't actually use my Shirogorov Hottie R because I don't want to mess it up and then lose all the value that I have, invested into that knife. Okay, cool. I still think you should maybe consider like, well, are you in the hobby for wrong reasons, or don't have any pretense and you just know that you're buying art, you're not actually buying tools. That's fine. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but I think you can get yourself into trouble of buying the wrong knives if you don't understand why you're even buying the knives yourselves. So sure, this is a budget. Maybe you're somebody that just doesn't have the money and you're like, I want a good workable knife on the cheap. I don't think this is filling that role either, because you're going to have to rely on the crazy sharpening all the time. Like once the knife dulls, which will happen if you're actually buying a tool on the cheap, how are you going to sharpen the sucker? Like the tools that you need at bare minimum are going to cost more than the knife itself. And so if that money, if you're like, well, that's fine, I could do it on other knives too, well then why don't you just invest that money into a nicer knife in the first place that maybe you won't have to sharpen so often, and you could get a cheap water stone to sharpen that and still spend the same amount of money. So this knife essentially kind of like explains itself away and makes it irrelevant because of the blade shape. As much as I like the aesthetics of it, the swedge, the finish, it is a good cutter, it's a high grind, like there are benefits, but in the end, a cheap knife that you have to awkwardly sharpen is just not a useful knife. So I don't know who this would really, make sense for, except for maybe a lefty who can buy the $25 one, stick it in your truck glove box and just use it as a beater, knowing that it's like a one-time use. Or maybe you're a knife nut and you just want to try all the knives and you already have all the crazy sharpening, or you want a knife to practice on or a challenge. Maybe this is a good option for you. I don't want to say it's worthless for everyone, but I'm struggling to find like a normal reason to get this knife. Even though what it is a decent budget knife, it just doesn't do it for me in this combination of blade, size, price, utility, steel. It just doesn't really add up for me. So that's it, everybody. Agree, disagree, sound off in the comments. Let me know if you are interested in more budget knives. I promise if I find a good budget knife, I'm not just going to crap on it because the steel is terrible. There are good budget knives, and I will try to help find them with you. That's it, everybody. Have a good one, and I'll see you in the next one.